Ancient storytelling is so phenomenal. It's beautiful and rich, but sometimes that beauty and richness is diluted when translated into modern languages. This is especially true of people's names. Names are important in ancient writing. We should be curious about them. Names usually have literal meanings that play a role in telling the story or helping us understand how this character is going to function in the story. We often miss this richness of the story when these names aren't translated literally. This is true in all sorts of ancient writing, and the book of Exodus is no exception. So let's take a look at some of the names that we run into in Exodus so that we can start to see what I'm talking about here. Let's start with the midwives who show up in chapter 1. So Pharaoh is trying to deal with the problem of the Hebrew people multiplying like crazy. So he comes up with a few ideas. The first one is to enslave them and try to make their lives miserable. When that doesn't work, he asks the Hebrew midwives to kill any baby boys that they help deliver. But let's look at how even just the names of these midwives play a role in the tone and imagery of the story. Right before we meet the midwives, we read this paragraph about Pharaoh enslaving the people. This is chapter 1, verses 11 through 14. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. What's the theme? What's the overall tone of this paragraph? What words dominate it? Oppress, force, labor, dread, worked ruthlessly, bitter, harsh, right? Many of those words were repeated, adding emphasis, creating a really heavy and dark, hopeless feeling. The very next verse, verse 15, says, the king of Egypt went to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah. So into this dark, hopeless scene enters these midwives, whose names are mentioned for some reason. That's not an accident. Shiphrah means brightness or beauty. Puah means splendid or splendor. So we have this description of the Hebrew people being enslaved that is so heavy and dark and hopeless, but then enter beauty and splendor. This is a reprieve for the audience who had been hearing this story orally originally. It's a hint that all hope is not lost, that things may seem like they're full of despair, but there are little glimmers of beauty and splendor in the midst of it all. And that's exactly what these two midwives bring, right? They thwart Pharaoh's plans, at least temporarily, by refusing to kill any babies and cleverly outsmarting Pharaoh. They bring a little beauty and splendor to an otherwise horrific scene. Isn't that awesome? Something similar happens when we meet Moses' soon-to-be father-in-law for the first time in Exodus 2. Moses has just fled Egypt because the Hebrews resent and reject him, and the Egyptians want to kill him. He's been rejected by both his birth and adoptive families. He's a man without a home, without a friend. He's alone in the wilderness until he meets the daughters of Reuel. Well, guess what Reuel means? Friend of God. It's not an accident. Here, Moses is literally no one. He's with literally no one, and he runs into friend of God, who generously and graciously welcomes Moses into his family and takes care of him. Every subsequent story that we have of Reuel shows him to be extremely kind, supportive, and generous towards Moses. There's a richness to the story that we miss when we don't see that right in this moment of intense despair, when Moses has just lost everything and has no one, into the story appears friend of God to take care of him. It's so good. I love it. The last name that we're going to look at is Moses' name. We're told in Exodus 2:8 that Pharaoh's daughter names Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now, there's some really interesting things going on here. First, keep in mind that Pharaoh has ordered all Hebrew baby boys to be drowned in the Nile. So the princess taking in Moses is in defiance of her father and wouldn't have been something that she'd be wanting to broadcast. So naming him a Hebrew name would not be a good idea, right? Well, Moses isn't a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian one. And it's a pretty generic name at that. It literally means child or son. In fact, there are a few pharaohs who chose names like Thutmose or Amos. Thut and Ah were both Egyptian gods, and these names meant son of Thut or son of Ah. So Moses' name was a thoroughly Egyptian one. On top of this, the Hebrew word for one who is drawn out is not Moses, but it's really close. In Hebrew, Moses is pronounced Moshe. The Hebrew word for one who is drawn out is mashah. Moshe, mashah. They sound really similar, but they're not the same word. Now, there's a few things that could be going on here. Some people contend the whole idea of the princess of Egypt being familiar with the language of the slaves is nonsensical. Combine this with the fact that she is trying to hide his origin. She would therefore not name him anything close to a Hebrew name. All these things considered, some people conclude that this detail in the story is a bit of a myth created to try to explain Moses' name from a Hebrew perspective. And that could totally be the case. But I think maybe there's something more beautiful going on here. While it would be quite extraordinary, there's no reason why the princess of Egypt couldn't have known some Hebrew. She seems to have a really soft spot for the Hebrew people, especially if she's willing to risk her life by adopting a Hebrew baby boy to protect him from her own father. That seems more extraordinary than the idea that she might have picked up some Hebrew along the way, right? But even if she didn't, the person who wrote this clearly knows Hebrew because they're writing in Hebrew, and therefore would obviously know that Moshe and Mashah aren't the same word. I mean, they're written right next to each other in the text. The wordplay is intentional. So there has to be more going on here than just someone getting this wrong. So let's assume what the story assumes, that the princess knows at least a little Hebrew. Her choice of name for Moses is actually really stunning. It's simultaneously a super generic Egyptian name that wouldn't raise any suspicions in the royal household. And at the same time, it's a name that honors this baby's Hebrew origins while also tying back into his story by sounding very close to this other word. That is genius. In just this one name, Pharaoh's daughter has captured a perfect blend of Moses' reality, a Hebrew living in secret among Egyptians. It's brilliant. And we miss all of that when we read the story in English. So I hope you can see names are important in ancient writing, especially in the Bible. Be curious about them. When you come across them, find out what they mean and see how that enhances or enriches your understanding of the story.